Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 8. This week, we'll be looking more at mediation. Last week, as you recall, we were discussing intractable conflicts, the various reasons why third parties will get involved as mediators, and we looked at ripeness. That is that space where conflicting parties meet a very subjective point where the entrance of a mediator would be more effective. This week, we're going to look more at mediation itself a little bit. First, a brief definition, which is probably a review for you if you read the text last week from Smith and Smock. Um, Mediation involves negotiations between or among conflicting parties, the services of a third party. It is a process where the parties themselves make the decision to resolve the conflict, and third party typically determines and controls much of the negotiation process. This third point about the parties themselves making decision to have and they have the final say on what they're agreeing to. This is an important distinction from arbitration. In arbitration, usually the third party will review both sides and then make a decision for them. And usually that decision is something that is legally binding. But in a mediation, the parties are the ones who ultimately decide, not the mediator. So since the conflicting parties are the ones who decide, even if they are influenced by the mediator or other outside parties, this is seen as an advantage for mediation. It's believed that since the parties are the ones who decide, ultimately, they are more likely to adhere to the agreement. Plus, the mediation environment is seen as a safer space where parties can air their concerns, their grievances. And since the mediator largely controls the process, though the mediator is not supposed to control the final decisions, a good mediator can establish ground rules to encourage mutual respect, or or a process that can help them to reach a consensus. Also, a good mediator should be able to handle when things get too heated, and if parties, start to go towards threats or attempting to intimidate each other, the mediator should know when to pause negotiations, where they need to step back, cool down, and then resume. If you read texts about mediation, I'm sure you'll find many different viewpoints. And if this is something that you are seriously considering for the future, I do encourage you to seek out those various viewpoints. For now, I just want to touch on three basic characteristics that are generally considered good practice for a mediator. That is self-determination, neutrality, and confidentiality. Similar to what we were just talking about, self-determination means that the conflicting parties have the ability to make decisions. This is self-determination in terms of their participation, the ability to discontinue if they wish, and in the final decision making. Practitioners of mediation generally say that engaging in mediation is completely voluntary. No one should be forced or coerced to participate. Self-determination means that parties have the ability to walk away. They don't need to continue if they are finding that the process is not serving their deeper interests, or they're finding the other party is not willing to compromise, or even if there's a lack of confidence in the process itself or in the mediator. Parties are supposed to have the freedom to step away and discontinue. In practice, this may not always be the case. If a powerful state, for example, is involved as the third party, there can be a lot of pressure for weaker parties to engage in mediation and to make concessions. So it's not truly 100% voluntary in those kind of cases. There can be many reasons for this. There can be time constraints, there could be material interest involved, or even just based on the professional training of the mediator themselves. They may be a little bit more leaning towards pressuring parties to move things forward, even if they're not ready. So remember that the mediator is not just having to consider the parties themselves. They are also the balancing the directives or the interests of whoever engaged them, whether that's their own government or the UN or an NGO. And each of those parties will have their interests on what they're hoping to get out of this whole process. So that's just something that each mediator has to balance. In a research study by Allard Dersman et al., came out just last year, they looked at 6,277 rounds of negotiations in both interstate and intrastate conflicts between 1989 and 2023. And out of these, 15.6% or 979 were mediated by a third party, in which that third party was also giving military support to one of the conflicting parties. So that support was either through providing weapons or funding or training or intelligence or logistics or providing safe havens or supporting their troop deployments. As you can imagine, this puts a huge added dynamic to the negotiation. This is what the authors called coercive mediation, where the third party is using their military support as a tool to force the parties to the table or to coerce them to make concessions or agreements. I want to highlight just three major findings of this study. First was the authors cite that the probability of conflicting parties agreeing to more formal negotiations is 17.7% without coercive mediation, but increases to 36.4% with coercive mediation. So if there's coercion or coercive mediation, this situation, they're more likely to agree to formal negotiations. Second, they found that the predicted probability of a ceasefire or peace agreement being concluded is 12.6% in the absence of a coercive mediation and to 20.2% with coercive mediation. So more likely to have a peacefire agreement if there is coercive mediation involved. Even though this is showing that it's more effective to have coercive mediation. The third finding was that even though it's effective in the short term, coercive mediation tends to not produce agreements which are durable. This is the comparisons of the probability of agreements surviving past 1 year, 2 years, and 5 years between coercive and non-coercive agreements. So as you can see, when there is coercive mediation, it's a lower probability that it will last. The agreement will last 1 year, 2 years, and 5 years. It's a higher percentage probability when there's not a presence of coercive mediation. So of course there are other forms of coercion which can enter a negotiation from the mediator, not just what the authors here in this study define it as, such as threat or bullying. Remember, we have to think about what is the goal of the mediation? Is it just to make an agreement? I would say no. In the end is not just to end the conflict. That's the short-term goal. But we have to think about what does it take to build the durable peace, the positive peace. We need the long-term vision of conflict transformation. And so in that case, the coercive mediation may be unhelpful in that regard. So the second characteristic that most practitioners agree is good practice is neutrality. The mediator is supposed to not favor one side over the other, and the mediator is not supposed to influence the outcome of the mediation process. So this is so that the parties involved can feel that the process is fair, that they are not going to get the short end of the stick, because the mediator is favoring one side. This is very important, especially in cases where one party seems to have a lot more power, external power, military power, political power, economic power over the other one. In theory, this is a good practice, also very difficult to achieve in reality. Some will say, some that you read out there, who study or practice mediation, they say that, well, neutrality is a myth. It's not possible. Some argue, however, also that some partiality can be helpful. Not that, a mediator should completely promote one side's interests over the other side, but the partiality of the third party may indicate that they have an interest in getting an outcome, and doing what is needed. Maybe the mediator is a little bit more interested in mobilizing necessary resources, in order to get that outcome, if there is some level of partiality. And it's just some things to consider. And the final characteristic, which is generally upheld as a good practice, is confidentiality. Most, if not all, professional mediations take place in private to protect the parties involved and the process of the mediation. The confidentiality, similar to our other characteristics, are helpful for building trust. There can be freer exchange of ideas if there is confidentiality, and you can trust that that will be upheld. And to kind of remove the mediation process and the substance of what is discussed, to move it away from the public eye and the public scrutiny. I believe we talked about it in a previous video, but sometimes the public tends to want to paint one side or the other as the good guys and the bad guys, which is not helpful if you're trying to create an environment where people can openly discuss, put things on the table, and actually talk about them and move forward in a positive way. So this confidentiality is important. Mediation may differ depending on what stage of conflict or the goals of that stage of the conflict. So I'm just going to go through each of these stages one by one. In the very early stage, you're focused on preventative diplomacy, which we've discussed before. When we're talking about the curve of conflict in the early stages, you're trying to prevent the conflict from getting even worse. In the early stage, the mediator would be focused on convincing the parties that they will face a huge cost in the future if they continue on their path of violence. They haven't seen that huge cost yet, but the mediator might want to, try to convince them that this is not worth it to continue on this trajectory. Let's, step back and talk. But this is difficult because in the early stages of the conflict, the parties tend to be overconfident that they will win because they haven't experienced that high cost yet. So the role of the outside party is to convince them that they are heading toward a future that is mutually hurting. People are feeling angry. They want to express their grievances, even violently. So reining them in can be challenging. Mediation as part of preventative diplomacy might involve convincing states to adjust their political or their legal frameworks so that people will have these nonviolent methods to address their issues with and be able to come to a peaceful resolution without continuing the trajectory towards greater violence. In a later stage of the conflict, may involve managing escalation. Escalation can happen generally either intentionally or unintentionally. Intentional escalation happens when one party attempts to retaliate against the other, to deter the other party from escalating, kind of this preemptive attacks, or this intentional escalation can help it happen when one party is trying to win militarily uh, over the other rather than resolve their issues diplomatically. The benefits of victory are seen as greater than what they think they could achieve through the diplomatic negotiations. Outside parties can use sanctions or arms embargoes or other tools to help reduce that belief amongst the parties that they can win militarily. Escalation can also happen unintentionally because of mutual misperceptions. When you're in a conflict, we tend to see the other side as more hostile than they intended, and we tend to see our own side's actions as less hostile than they appear to be. So outside parties can help encourage the conflicting parties to overcome these misperceptions and become aware of their hostilities and how they're being perceived by the other side. Um, and a mediator might use interactive conflict resolution tools to help the different sides to see from each other's viewpoints, develop some empathy towards the other, or see how the other side is viewing and experiencing the escalation. Again, not a very easy task, but important. One of the very first stages of a mediation effort is typically to negotiate a ceasefire. You can't talk more about substantial issues if you're killing each other actively, right? So before making a more substantial and, talked over agreement, there's first typically going to be a ceasefire. Many ceasefires end up breaking down. So this is, again, not an easy task. Actually, research from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies shows that 80% of ceasefires break down. When they were looking at 196 conflicts between 1975 and 2011. Even though this is a very high percentage, they also found that the second or the third ceasefire within that same conflict tends to hold better. So it's again this confidence building measure. You experience, you try, and even if it breaks down, usually the second or the third attempt is a little bit more stable. Some of the things that mediator has to be aware of, which contribute to this challenge, which contributes to ceasefires breaking down, is spoilers. Always the spoilers getting in the way. Domestic politics, which either oppose agreements or they pressure the negotiators, the parties to the conflict, to maximize their own interests and to not compromise. And parties may be pressured to reject the demands or the requests from the other side because of those domestic politics. The people who are behind them and ultimately maybe calling the shots. Another challenge for keeping ceasefires is that political leaders can sometimes do what they call painting themselves in a corner. Basically, they might advocate publicly for some desirable or unrealistic goal of the negotiation. They say like, we're going to get this from the other party and we're going to make sure this, and really, they promise things to the public without yet going into the negotiation. So they paint themselves in the corner, and then they're less likely to make concessions when, later they're going to have to face those same people again and say, well, I made these promises, but I can't, it's about losing face. So yeah, just make it's difficult to go back on public declarations at the risk of losing face. Another reason that ceasefires can break down is their deadlines can be premature. Forcing parties to come to some kind of agreement before they're totally ready or they're totally able to come on board. Not all things could be addressed yet, so things fall through the cracks when you're trying to quickly, in the interest of saving lives and helping people, you want to call the ceasefire, but then things happen, falls through the cracks, and then the ceasefire breaks down. So, of course, the ceasefire is only the first part of the puzzle. Ceasefires don't guarantee that peace will follow. So, in this post-conflict implementation stage, it's very important for trying to address the drivers of the conflict. This is where, with the breathing room of a ceasefire, the parties can start to construct a peace agreement through their negotiation with the help of the mediator. Ceasefires break down often because they are not properly enforced, and they also the ceasefires themselves don't produce negotiations that address the underlying causes that are driving the conflict. That's why you need further negotiations to talk more about the positions, the interests behind those positions, and how to move forward for each party. And also, the ceasefires don't address the resentment or the enmity that is created from the violence. Peacekeepers will, such as from the UN, will often be utilized to help with enforcing the ceasefires to protect civilians, while those more in-depth negotiations are taking place. As I mentioned, the UN often sends peacekeeping missions, and also regional organizations such as the African Union more and more are filling this role as well as peacekeepers. Civil society organizations, it can also be utilized with monitoring ceasefires. They can provide early warning when things look like they're starting to break down, so that people can be aware and make the right choice for how to move forward. Smith and Smock, in our reading from last week, they go through the various aspects of formulating and constructing the peace agreement, from determining the participants to arranging the logistics, engaging the public and the media, coordinating with track 2 efforts, and then also constructing the actual agreement. They go through that in our reading last week. So I'm not going to get into all of that. Please read it if you haven't yet, since it's a good general overview. But it's important to note that formulating and signing the agreement is just the first step, right? And there's a need for continued engagement. The mediator and the parties involved would also have to have clear plans for implementation, for monitoring, and for outside parties would have to provide assistance to make it successful. The mediation is not just the meetings themselves. It's not just the agreement that is signed, a piece of paper, but it's a much bigger commitment than that. So the agreement must also consider how the state, which is emerging from that conflict, can build good governance. People need to have nonviolent ways to address their conflicts and address their issues, ways that are reliable and trustworthy. This takes time to build and should also be based on the cultural context of that country. Imposing something rarely works. There are some experts, just for example, that say that having elections too early in the post-conflict implementation phase is actually more harmful than good, because parties who remain on very opposite sides, very polarized, their agreement is signed and you have an election, but if there's no reconciliation and there's no effort for transformation, then basically those parties start to use political means to get their goals, and they're still polarized and they're still on the opposite ends. They're just using different methods to one up each other or attack each other. While that might be preferable to violence, it doesn't help reconcile or create a cohesive community and a positive peace. And finally, um, still making the peace agreement and monitoring and implementing is not the end. There's still the long-term conflict transformation and how it can be accomplished. I just wanted to read for you this one quote from these authors. I think it sums it up very well. The ultimate goal of conflict management is to produce a stable and durable peace in which the threat of large-scale violence is essentially absent and in which a community is created that accepts diversity of goals and interests, but seeks to reconcile these through an inclusive and peaceful process. Over time, stable peace becomes durable as former combatants become reconciled with one another and accept one another as part of a shared community in which different interests will inevitably persist, but where those differences will be resolved through an open political process devoid of threat and violence. Again, not an easy task. Very important, very difficult to achieve. In order to enhance the probability of being able to move that post-conflict community in that direction, here are some important things to note. The peace process should focus on looking forward to the possibility of a better future, not just looking at the past grievances. Yes, talking about the interests and addressing those interests and addressing past misconceptions is very important, but we can't lose sight of the future goal and where we want to head, the future that we want to build. Active engagement of civil society can also be very beneficial in building that future. You know, it's not just the political elites, it's not just the people who are in power and government who have to work towards that peaceful future. It is also the people on the ground, the citizens, the regular people who have to overcome misperceptions, overcome hatred or the desire for revenge, or get even economic and financial support, because poverty is also a big factor in all of this. So grassroots civil society organizations, especially women's groups, have been very effective in helping to foster this change of mindset and finding a more hopeful future amongst the citizens of the country. There often needs to be a process of reconciliation in this long-term conflict transformation phase. Even though we do need to look toward a future vision, we can't just say, well, the past doesn't matter, let's just put it back there. But that traumatic past created the current situation. People experience a lot of trauma living through violent conflict, which has to be addressed. Actually, in a future week, we will be talking more about restorative justice and truth and reconciliation efforts, which have been used for this purpose. But just for now, to say that the need for this kind of reconciliation, the long-term transformation of people's perception and in their ability to work together peacefully and cohesively should be considered in making the initial peace agreement. So all of this is very technical and theoretical, but as you're looking at your chosen conflict for your final paper and considering how mediation might play a role, or how mediation has played a role successfully or unsuccessfully, and in this week as you're researching this for your assignment, you'll be looking at one particular mediator. I wanted to give you a few additional considerations for you just to think about and possibly look into for your for your for your final paper and this week's assignment. The first is mediation over identity. We can negotiate about the technical aspects of the peace agreement, such as power sharing in the government, access to water or to land, reparations to victims of violence, these technical aspects. But all of this will not transform the society into positive peace if we don't also address questions of identity. And what does this mean? So groups of people, whether we are from the same religion or ethnicity or region or nation, we all have a collective group identity. I have an inner narrative, for example, as an American. I share that group. I share that kind of collective identity with other Americans of what it means to be American. This identity is shaped by perceptions of history, our collective memory of the past, and also stories that we tell about ourselves and about our place in the world. And so conflicts are not just about material gains or the external interests. There's also group identities and narratives which create significant clashes. Just think, for example, about Israel and Palestine. They each have their own narrative about why the current conflict is happening and why they each have a superior claim on that land, right? And that contributes to the conflict. It's not just about the land itself. It's about the historical and the religious and the spiritual significance for each group. So that's about identity. So making a concession or compromise in a peace agreement may also be challenging to the very core of the group's identity. This creates an existential crisis, and most people avoid that at all costs. But negotiations often do not open up to this kind of discussion and reformation of the group's identity. We kind of think that the identity is fixed. This is the way it is, but maybe it is something that can be negotiated and discussed. And many experts will argue that we do need to include identity in the early stages of negotiation and mediation. It's not just about interests and positions, or dividing up the pie or increasing the pie. If people in their minds have a narrative about why this conflict is happening or why their group deserves this or deserves that, then we're never going to get to peace, not true conflict transformation that we're trying to get to. Conflict can easily erupt again, and at most we could have a negative peace. An example of this is Bosnia. The Dayton Agreement is generally regarded as a great success in mediation. We haven't seen another outbreak of war at the same level as in the 1990s, but this country is still deeply divided along ethnic lines. There were the three primary ethnic communities, the Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosniaks. They each had their narrative, their identity about the war and what happened and why, and those narratives were not discussed or reconciled. So there's not much intergroup dialogue today. There's still antagonism, and ethnicity is used to generate political power, and the war continues in people's minds. So when these antagonistic narratives, which shape identity, are not negotiated and addressed, then one thing is that we characterize a whole group as either perpetrators or as victims. And always, of course, my group is the victim. And so collective memories and narratives are entangled with our group's sense of security. So to address that or to attack that is to attack your very self. So the narratives, they get fixed, and it becomes more about, okay, well, we have to remember our story, and others are misrepresenting us and our story. And again, this creates a very uncomfortable inner crisis, an existential crisis, and it creates an us versus them kind of thinking. And the shift in the narrative is very difficult, but it's critical for positive peace and transformation. As one author and analyst puts it, what distinguishes adversaries from enemies is the relational aspect of respect. For the granting and withholding of recognition and respect, narratives of the past have a core role in transformation, as sustained exclusive roles of enmity and victimhood are rooted in conflicting narratives about the past. Therefore, conflict transformation calls attention to how complicated history, inequitable economic conditions, and political dynamics are all entangled in identity struggles. All of this is difficult to achieve and practice as long as each party has fortified its self-representation as victim and depicted the other as perpetrator. The narratives of the past should not, however, be regarded as fixed and predetermined. There is room for a dialogic transformation of memories and identities by renegotiating the narratives of the past. One country that I think has been very successful in tackling this is Rwanda after the 1994 genocide. They systematically and intentionally reframed the narrative, rewriting their own history to dismantle genocide ideology, which put the Hutus against the Tutsis, and they taught how that division originated from false ideas about ethnic superiority, which really came from the colonial powers. These kind of things are never perfect, but there are more and more people in Rwanda who are thinking less as victims and as perpetrators, and us and them. We are Rwandan, and even working together substantially to help their communities. I'm sorry, my picture didn't appear here. I don't know what happened. The second consideration is criticisms that the predominant model of peace building we have seen so far, including in mediation, is Western imposition. Especially after the end of the Cold War, the prevailing idea about peace was what was called liberal peacemaking. That is the assumption that promoting democracy, good governance, the rule of law, and a market economy are universal norms and guidelines for stable peace. So naturally, the peace deals that were made throughout these decades and even now, today, will heavily promote these ideas, and mediators will push for these things to be put into place. Western democracies have developed along a certain historical trajectory. And because of that history, they are where they are today. But a lot of that history involved exploitation of poorer countries, even enslavement of entire peoples. So then to turn around and say in the modern era that, well, what we have is the standard, but these other countries don't share the same history. Actually, they were probably on the receiving end of the exploitation. So it seems like a huge hypocrisy. Well, we didn't develop the same way. So some would say that it is a coercion or an imposition. Even critics of liberal peace building would say this is merely an extension of Western imperialism. And these values are not universal. They are Western values being forced on non-Western states. And that usually it is the interests of the third-party interveners, which are placed at a higher priority than those within the country. The culture, the history, the social and political structures of those receiving the intervention, they also need to be considered. Critics say that liberal peace building has brought more conflicts instead of resolving them. It creates a divide between the urban elites and the rural poor, and it disconnects the people from their ancestral, historical, and social foundations. It's a top-down approach. As one author puts it, who was highly critical of liberal peace building, says that the question is, the question is, does this address the needs of the rural population, for instance, in Africa? The right response to this question would be it does not, because the rural majority find itself rendered alien to that neoliberal dispensation that benefit the urban elite. indigenous local institutions and authorities are consciously and systematically undermined. So local or traditional rules, practices, institutions are not utilized sufficiently or even purposefully undermined in many cases. They are deemed inherently unfit, even if some of the accusations, well, these local traditions are, exclusive, they exclude women, or so then, they're no good. But this imposition from the outside and subjugation has contributed to many of the problems that we see today. So even in the interests of promoting something that is good and as an ideal for the future, but if it's done in a superior or a coercive way, then it's going to cause more problems. So some trace actually a long history of mediation back to ancient Greece and even into ancient to present day China. For thousands of years have practiced mediation in different forms. Mediation as a conflict resolution process or very similar processes have been found in many traditional societies as well. It's not just about the Western or the Northern way, the global North way of doing things. In some cases, those traditional practices declined or even disappeared, including because of colonialism. In colonial systems, those traditional practices were prohibited. Some of those traditional practices may have had a greater focus on community healing rather than empowering the parties of the conflict. In the US, mediation essentially rose within the legal system where judges and lawyers realized that engaging a mediator was more efficient and less costly than going through the courts. But as a mediator, I think it is crucial to understand how the mediator's help might be perceived or received by the people in that country, and be very careful about superiority. This comes back to impartiality. The mediator is not there to impose certain decisions, but is a role of service, helping the parties to take ownership so they can build their own future. And also to consider the local institutions, the norms, the knowledge, or customs, which can be very useful for the goals of conflict transformation. There may be some great indigenous practices of conflict resolution or community healing, which can be called upon in a peace process. One interesting example that I just learned about recently is, oh, my picture didn't come again. No. Is called the Malwul Rom Project, started in 2024, which sought to bring reconciliation between Indigenous and white Australians. It's based on using Indigenous practices of dispute resolution, mediation, and peacemaking among the, I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this, the Yolngu people, as a Indigenous tribe in Australia. This project was initiated by Reverend Dr. Gandhara. He's an elder of the Durili clan. In his own words, he says, that part of the quote is down there at the bottom. It is a healing ceremony. It heals people's relationships. It is an opportunity to heal the hurt, the pain, the scar of the past. It is through the Malwul ceremony that we bring people together into the spirit of reconciliation. An interesting thing is that the trends are kind of shifting these days. Between 1990 and 2022, the most frequent third parties were the UN, Russia, the US, the African Union, and the EU. Western states, especially the US, Norway, France, and the UK, have historically dominated state-level mediation. Norway and Switzerland, in particular, built reputations as preferred mediators due to perceived neutrality. However, the role of Western states is declining. while other third parties such as Qatar, Turkey, and IGAD, which is the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in Africa, those third parties are on, and their role is on the rise. And an increasing number of conflict mediators are coming from the East instead of the West and the global South rather than the global North. Of course, that doesn't mean that, not coming from the North and not coming from the West is automatically inherently better, but we need to be careful of that assumption as well. But it can mean that more perspectives are entering the mediation space. And I think it can mean, though, of course, we can look more at the research that's being done in this area, mediation can be less of an imposition from powerful nations and more supportive of cultural sensitivities and awareness. I hope that's the future we're looking towards. But the challenge with all of these many new entrants into mediation is that of coordination. Coordination between many different actors remains poor in many cases. And if everyone has their own agenda, or there's the NGOs or the UN, and then there's state level mediators trying to make a difference, and they're not coordinating with each other, it just creates a lot more problems of implementation and coming to a final resolution. And my pictures are not showing up. Anyway, the final consideration that I want to cover is that of including women in the mediation space. Women and girls bear some particular impacts of armed conflict, one of which is sexual violence. Rape is frequently used as a weapon of war. 92% of victims who experience sexual violence related to conflicts are women and girls. Globally, 25% of women and girls experienced food insecurity, and that number is 50% in conflict areas. Maternal mortality is higher in conflict zones. The incidence of child marriage is also higher in conflict zones. In 2024, it was found that 676 million women and girls are living within 31 miles or 50 kilometers from an armed conflict. And this is the highest number since the 1990s. So despite the fact that conflict equally, or in some cases disproportionately, impacts women, women are often not included in the mediation and negotiation spaces. The trends are shifting, which is hopeful, but there's still more to be done. Between 1992 and 2019, women made up 13% of negotiators, 6% of mediators, and 6% of signatories in major peace processes. In 2023, according to the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General's report on women, peace, and security, showed that 9.6% of negotiators and 13.7% of mediators and 26.6% of signatories were women. That is in 50 peace processes analyzed just in 2023. And then in 2025, among 2,299 negotiation delegates, 3.9% of those delegates were women on average. Sorry, it wasn't for 2025, but that study came out in 2025. According to UN Women, women's participation increases the probability of a peace agreement lasting at least 2 years by 20% and a peace agreement lasting 15 years by 35%. So that's pretty good numbers. According to the American Political Science Review, only a 1% increase in women delegates, that actually doubles the likelihood of an agreement that will contain provisions for women. There's also evidence that in mediation teams with greater gender equality, there is a higher probability of reaching a peace agreement and there's a greater variety of mediation strategies used because it's important to bring these different perspectives which can balance and complement the team. In a subsequent week, we will be talking more about women's role in conflict and in peace building, especially the particular aspects that women bring and can contribute. But this is what I wanted to touch on for now in terms of mediation. This is just to highlight the importance of intentionally including women in the peace process. If that intention is not there, then women are very easily forgotten and left out. And then the resulting peace agreement doesn't contain provisions for women. Conflict impacts men and women differently. Everyone suffers under conflict. There's no monopoly on suffering. But it impacts women differently. So there might need to be different provisions for women in the agreement. I mentioned sexual violence. How do you take care of the survivors after the conflict is over? If you have a society where women cannot easily own property, for example, or, they have limited rights, but you have a lot of widows after the conflict, well, what's going to happen to them? How are they going to be taken care of? Women are also usually concerned about children. So the health and the safety of children is important in any peace agreement. Um, these are just some considerations for you to think about as you're considering the pros and cons of mediation and various mediation efforts that have happened in the past. This week, your assignment is to look at one individual who acted as a mediator in national or international settings. Consider their style, what you could learn from them, what are some of their weaknesses and their strengths. Do you think they were an effective mediator? Why or why not? What were some of the good practices you could see in their mediation and what they've done and accomplished? Are they culturally sensitive? Do they intentionally seek out other perspectives, or have they included women intentionally in their negotiation teams? These are just some questions for you to look into and think about. And this week, I'll also post some of the resources in case you wanted to take a look further. And we'll see you next week.